We are exceptionally lucky to have Zia Yusuf joining us. Zia, as you will know, has been appointed today as the intellectual powerhouse who will be driving reform's policy agenda in the run-up to the next general election. So please put your hands together to welcome the Spectator's guest this afternoon, Zia Yusuf. Zia, welcome onto the Spectator stage. You've been at Spectator events before, and today Nigel announced that you are going to be driving the policy agenda for the next general election. What does that role involve, and what are the top 2 or 3 priorities in terms of policy that you will be working on?
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here. It's so important. You know, we have so much energy and optimism as part of this conference, and it's what fuels all of us. It fuels the entire movement. Thanks to the Spectator for hosting this event too. So what does head of policy means? It's kind of exactly what it sounds like. You know, it's what it says on the tin. We've got to get together a group, quite a large group actually, of people who really know their stuff, who have common sense, who are fearless, who have courage, who are going to work together and put together the most cohesive and patriotic and first principles policy agenda that is going to be the foundation of a reform first term of government. I sincerely believe, if the British people see fit to elect a reform government, that Nigel will be the most transformative Prime Minister of our lifetimes in this country, and not by a little bit, I think by a lot, in no small part because that'll be exactly what the doctor will have ordered. I mean, the state the country is in now, and I say this with no joy whatsoever, it will pale into insignificance by the time this shambolic, clownish Labour government are done with it. I mean, just look at the reshuffle today, right? I mean, I want to be horrible, but so you failed in one department, have a go with another department, right? In which you have absolutely no expertise whatsoever. So a lot of it is actually going to be about the right people, you know, people who really know their stuff. And that will mean people from business. It'll mean people who have worked inside the NHS, for example. It'll be senior people from our military who have served our country with distinction. Essentially, it's a business concept of, you know, skin in the game. People who really, really know their stuff. And we've got to get started now. You know, earlier on today, I was talking to a very well-respected broadsheet newspaper, and they said, oh, well, Zia, when you talk about this, you talk with a sense of inevitability. A sense of inevitability. I said, well, listen, we take nothing for granted. Absolutely nothing for granted. We have fought tooth and nail. Everybody here, you have willed this political movement into existence from thin air in the space of a few short years. You've done things that nobody thought was possible, even a few months ago. And so it would be irresponsible of us to not be preparing for government. If we don't start planning now, then if the British people see fit to vote us in, which does look probable right now, if that happens and we are ill-prepared, then we will have betrayed the British people. So we have to start now. We need great lawyers, great draftsmen to draft the legislation. We need great operational plans. People need to be philosophically aligned that this is the politics of what is in the interests of British people, and be totally unapologetic about that. If that means withdrawing from international treaties, so be it, right? If that means, you know, Nigel turning around. You know what was really interesting? When we announced Operation Restoring Justice at that hangar in Oxfordshire, you know, a lot of the press, you know, one of the first questions was, well, you know, Nigel, are you going to send back XYZ person back to this particular war-torn country or despotic regime? And Nigel said, you know what? The Prime Minister of this country, if he becomes Prime Minister, he cannot be held responsible for the actions of every despotic regime in the world. But you know who the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom should be responsible to? The people of the United Kingdom. And so that is what we're going to focus on. So it's a lot of work. It's certainly not just going to be me. We're going to have lots of excellent people, but I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks, Zia. Thank you. I'm just going to ask a few questions about Zia Yusuf, the man, and then a few more questions about policy. And then we'll invite some questions from the floor. So if anyone does want to ask a question or to put a point, think through now. But I will insist that all questions are brief, that they are questions, not statements, and that they observe the courtesy that we would naturally extend to any treasured guest. Zia, you had a hugely successful business career. And you'd been successful in financial services at a young age. Why, when your entrepreneurial success was assured and a comfortable life was ahead of you, why take the risk of getting involved in the bear pit of politics? What motivated you to make that leap?
Because I love my country, and I love the people of this country. And, you know, one of the things, it's going to sound extraordinarily corny, but, you know, one of the things that I always felt really depressed about with the UK was the utterly appalling caliber of people that were making the most important decisions of the land. I mean, sadly, politics is, not only is it not a meritocracy, it's an idiocracy. Being meritorious was like actually maladaptive inside the political system. And that is how we ended up with people like Matt Hancock as our health secretary during the greatest health emergency since World War II. It's why we have Rachel Reeves who somehow survived the reshuffle. She's making the most important economic decisions in the country. While we have Mad Ed Miliband running our energy policy. I would argue actually a country's energy policy is the single most important portfolio certainly during peacetime. And so, you know, I looked at it and thought, look, this country, I didn't come from money. My parents came here from Sri Lanka in the early 1980s. My father had just qualified as a doctor. My mum's a nurse. And, you know, they've given 50 years of service to the NHS between them. And they still practice to this day. And sometimes people go, well, Zia, why haven't you retired them? I could pay them all the money I have. I could not stop them being caregivers, because that's who they are, right? And they love the country too. And so they gave me love and they gave me an education. I won a 50% scholarship to go to a great school. And I couldn't not be more grateful. I don't think my story is possible in many countries in the world. And so I thought, you know, I've now sold my company. I've done pretty well. I've frankly had some luck, of course, along the way. That's a huge part of it. And I think social mobility, of which I'm a reasonable example, I think that is on the wane in this country. And any student of history will tell you, as soon as social mobility is on the wane and is disappearing in any civil society, it is not civil for very long. You get to a very dark place very quickly. So I want every young person in this country to have the same kind of opportunity set that I did. This country welcomed my parents. I was born in Scotland. My little sister was born in Truro in Cornwall. My parents had to go wherever the work was. But you know what the common denominator was? Wherever they went, the people of this country were so welcoming to them. And I really worry that, you know, because we've had successive governments that have just left our borders open, that have allowed people who have consciously decided to come here and break our rules as the first action that they're going to take. I think, by the way, you know, I want to say this too. Nobody is more upset about the state of affairs with illegal immigration in this country than legal migrants. I get this all of the time. So look, the short answer, that's the long answer. The short answer is I love my country. I love tall orders. And, you know, when Nigel said he was going to come back, you know, I'd sold my company to an American bank. I was getting ready to emigrate and go to America, start a company in Silicon Valley. And then Nigel said he was going to come back after, remember, initially saying he wasn't. Do you remember? And, you know, in tech, the law of the founder is true and real, right? Like founder-led, you know, if you have an outstanding founder, that level of leadership and the ability to inspire can bring to bear companies like NVIDIA, whose market capitalization, by the way, is bigger than the GDP of the United Kingdom under somebody like Jensen. Nigel is the ultimate political founder, right? He believes in anything he says, you'd better believe Nigel believes. And so when he said he was coming back, I said, all right, yeah, let's do this. And after we won 14% of the vote share and 5 seats, and he said, you know, would you be chairman? Let's go and see if we can win the next general election. I said, yeah, it would be the honor of my life to do that. And I couldn't be prouder of what we've achieved together.
You mentioned you were born in Scotland. Obviously, you spent just a few years there before your parents moved on. What does being born in Scotland mean to you?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I love the Scottish people, and yeah. And you know what my mum still says to this day? No offense to any English people, but she said no one has been friendlier to them than Scottish people. And the Scottish people are amazing. And my elder brother went to 6 different primary schools because, again, my dad had to go and do wherever there was work. It was kind of a really archetypal immigrant story. Thankfully, by the time I started going to school, they'd kind of settled in the south of the country. But what does it mean to me? I think I feel like I have a really strong connection at Scotland. I love going back there. I spoke at our Scottish conference last year. It saddens me how much Scotland has been ravaged, frankly, by appalling governance from the SNP. And I also really dislike how I think Scotland, sadly, has become almost the epicenter of this identitarian identity politics, right? It worries me, the talk of trying to detach Scotland from the Union. I think, the United Kingdom must remain the United Kingdom. And of course, Scotland has its own national identity, just like Wales does. And I think that's really important that they maintain that. But, we are stronger together as a union. So, it means a lot to me. And look, I think it's one of the most interesting conversations, I guess, of our time. What does it mean to be British? What does it mean to be Scottish? What does it mean to be English? And, this isn't a nation of immigrants in the way that perhaps the United States is. But I think it is important that we come together and we find the things that the values that we share. And I think British values are a very important thing. I think national identity is also a very important thing. And I think the amount of invective that has been laid out in the press and the way people have been made to feel, for example, apparently raising a national flag has become some sort of act of far-right thuggery and things like that. I think this is extremely dangerous. And I think the argument that if you're English or if you're Scottish or if you're Welsh, you're not entitled to a national identity in the way that any other country, whether it would be Pakistan or India or Sri Lanka or Australia for that matter, I think this is a deeply poisonous thing that has been spread in this country. We should be really, really proud of our national identities.
Do you have any political heroes?
There's a guy called Nigel, who I rate quite highly. Well, look, we can expand a bit on that, because, again, I'm a big believer in look at what people do, not what they say, right? And so when people say to me, do you think Nigel can be Prime Minister? I say, well, listen, kind of frankly, as you said, after having not come for money, I sold my company, and I was in a blessed position of not having to work for money anymore at a relatively young age. And I've dedicated, frankly, my entire life over the last 14 and a half months and subjected myself to what comes with the territory of frontline politics into doing everything I can to making Nigel our next Prime Minister of the country. And so that's the proof point on that. And it's because I believe in him. I think he's an extraordinary man. Outside of that, I would say, I think I'm a reasonably... I've spent quite a lot of time studying American politics, for example. And I think, people like John F. Kennedy were very, very interesting and did some really interesting things. Abraham Lincoln did too. But the biggest one for me, and again, super cliched, is Sir Winston Churchill. Because, I think the things that, when you talk about cometh the hour, cometh the man, when you talk about being consistent for a whole number of years, he would not have been given the opportunity to take Hitler on had he not been so prescient and consistent in his views, in articulating what Hitler was really up to. And I don't want to draw unreasonable comparisons, but one of the reasons, no doubt, and I say this as someone who built like a consumer brand and built a consumer app, one of the reasons I think reform has surged in the way that it has is because Nigel has built his brand over 30 years. People know what Nigel stands for. And if you look at, I did a session earlier today with Merlin, a polling company, that suggests even people, a plurality of the people who wouldn't even vote for reform today, say that if Nigel was the Prime Minister, the votes would stop like that, right? Because people know Nigel will do whatever it takes to do the things he says he wants to do. And so, ultimately, I think I have huge respect for people who say things regardless of the social consequence of doing it. Remember all those years ago when Nigel used the word invasion? Do you remember that? And all the stick he got? Now, when we talk about invasion, we don't really get any pushback because the dictionary definition of an invasion is an incursion by a mass of people in an unwanted way. And if more people have turned up on our beaches uninvited over the last 8.5 years and turned up on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, then one can, I think, accurately describe that as an invasion. Do you remember the billboard, the Breaking Point billboard? Do you remember that? Well, Lord, if that wasn't Breaking Point then, it certainly is now. So Nigel has been campaigning on these issues. And that's why, by the way, when they attack Nigel, you know, he's now being attacked by Labour for being unpatriotic, which is the most hilarious. I'd love to meet the person who's coming up, the 21-year-old special advisor who's coming up with these mad ideas. It won't stick. It won't stick because even people who might have some, you know, not be at the stage where they're willing to vote for Nigel, the idea that he is unpatriotic is so absurdly wrong on its face that it cannot stand.
Do you believe in God? And if so, what does your faith mean to you?
Yeah, I do believe in God, yeah. You know, I have a tech background, and I think, you know, one of the signs that there's life anywhere is you know, where there's information in a very concentrated way. And so that's my opinion. I think that the idea that everything that is around us is purely a matter of just confluence and randomness, I think that's a difficult position to sustain when you look at any other matter where you're looking for signs of life or intelligence in particular, right? The information. And the more you study, against the JFK quote, you know, the more we learn, the more we realize how ignorant we are. I'm paraphrasing, maybe I butchered that. But, you know, what does my faith mean to me? Look, I will say this. I think that when you're making public policy, you need to make public policy and you need to pass legislation and campaign for things that are in the interests of everybody in the country. And I think one of the things that is really scary in this country, actually, is that we are, if we carry on the trajectory that we are headed for sectarian politics. And by the way, as someone whose family came from Sri Lanka, I will tell you I have some experience of where that leads. It is not pleasant. It is deeply, deeply unpleasant. And I wrote about this in the Telegraph before I'd really entered it was really my first entrance into frontline politics. I said that if this country does not change course, and change, like when I say change course, I mean literally do the opposite and turn around and go in the opposite direction, we're headed to a very dark place, an extremely dark place. And so, you know, we need to be in a position where, you know, and look, I say this as somebody who is a Muslim. The idea that we should have an Islamophobia law which makes one particular religion, making it illegal to criticize one particular religion, is not only not in the national interest, it isn't even in Muslims' interest. Because if you, look, anyone who understands psychology, anyone who has looked after kids, anyone who has taught a class in school, they'll tell you one surefire way of getting kids bullied in class, how do you do it? You get the teacher to give them demonstrable preferential treatment in front of the other kids. What people want is an even legal system and an even policing system. We cannot have one rule for one group of people and one rule for another. And I'm afraid that is exactly what we have had for far too long in this country. And by the way, the number of Muslims who have told me they totally agree with that, the number of Muslims who tell me no one is more alarmed than them, than some of the nutty imams who go and put this stuff out on TikTok talking about one of career. So, look, we've got to get a handle on this situation. We've got to start being serious about saying, if we want to have a restoration of the social contract in this country, we must deport people who are here in the country illegally. It is totally unfair and unreasonable to expect people who are paid into the system their whole lives. As I said in my speech, a single mum I spoke to who works 2 jobs to be able to pay the bills for her son, only to find a family moves in, well, a whole HMO moves in next door to her on the estate of fighting age men from Afghanistan which she's then asked to pay for. We have to be serious about saying that any people, anyone, regardless of your faith or creed, coming to this country saying they want to subvert the entire legal order in this system. I'm sorry, no, you're not going to do that. We have our own legal system. We have English common law. We have a parliamentary democracy, and we're very proud of that. So if no one is willing to stand up and draw those bright red lines, the country will head to a very dark place. The good news is while we've been making these arguments, while Nigel and everyone else in the party has been making these arguments, we've gone from 14% to 33 to 35% in the polls. And we have now a real prospect of exactly what I'm talking about, a total reversal and undoing of 20 years of damage to this country.
To move from the personal to the political, earlier in the year you resigned as Reform Party chairman, and then of course...
I remember.
And then of course returned to the colours, as it were. Can you tell us a little bit about why you stepped down at the time, how it felt, and why you came back?
Yeah, look, I've been pretty open about this. I don't think it's going to be news to anyone. Look, I was just exhausted. It was an error of judgment born of the fact that I hadn't had a day off in about 8 days, so like literally pretty much every single day, even when we were fighting those May the 1st elections, which we're really proud of, because thanks to all of you, we delivered the most historic electoral result in local elections, I think, in our lifetimes in this country. Decisively broke that duopoly, of the two old parties. And even after that, and I was at the count in Runcorn and Helsby up until God knows what hour, if you remember, counting, making sure they counted every vote, and Sarah won, I think, by 6 votes. It was straight off, even then I didn't sleep. I went straight off to media, and then we had our celebratory event, and then it was standing up our new councils. So I was exhausted, made an error of judgment. But the good news is, I came back. So look, we're not perfect, but I will say when we make errors, we look to rectify them extremely quickly. I mean, I joke and say resigning was the only way I was going to get a couple of days off, right? So I had to do that and come back. But, Nigel was incredibly, gracious. And look, the other thing that really, really impacted my mindset at the time was the amount of correspondence I got. So many messages from people, emails, DMs after the fact. I got letters, which came through obviously after the fact, but just telling me how important reform was to people. I get not everyone in the country supports us, but a lot of people do. More people than any other party support us. And they say to us, look, reform isn't just a political party to them. It's not just a political movement. To them, it is the last hope this country has, this great, proud nation has to turn itself around for them, for their kids, and for their grandkids. And so that was hugely influential for me. And I realized that actually, no, I've got to continue the journey, and I'm really glad that I did.
You mentioned the success at the local elections and, of course, at the Runcorn election, and that's attributed in large part not just to Nigel Farage's leadership, but to the professionalization that you brought to the party machine. But, of course, around the time, I won't make any connection, around the time that you stepped back, a newly elected MP said something that attracted attention that was not party policy. Yep. And since then, there have been a number of enthusiastic reform supporters who've strayed somewhat from the official line. What does the party need to do in its next phase to truly professionalize? And is there a risk that it may lose some of the freshness that is attractive to people who are put off by established politics?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I want to address the thing about the burqa thing, because that was this whole completely fake narrative that was suddenly created. And I understand because it's a seductive narrative, but, I actually was very quick to say, look, it isn't party policy or whatever, but my personal view, if you ask me my personal view, there should be a ban on face coverings in public. And that would include the burqa. That would include, the crazy Antifa thugs that bear down on people like you, at our events. And look, if you're in any doubt about that, if you're walking down the street, if you leave and you're walking down the street and there's someone with a face mask walking down the street towards you, what do? You cross the road. And I don't think that's fair. I also think it's insane. This is another thing that's happened. We're in a country now where the law basically only applies to people who are willing to obey the law, right? So, for example, London is one of the CCTV. There is not a city in the world that per square foot is more surveilled by CCTV than London. But you can opt out of that surveillance, if you like, by just popping on a face mask, right? I don't see how that's fair. In fact, many of the people who are choosing to pop on that face mask are precisely the people who actually those cameras are there to supposedly surveil. So, I was very clear about that. And look, on the burqa itself, many countries have banned it in public. And look, my humble opinion is that social contact, human-to-human social contact, that is the bedrock of any civil society, whether you like it or not, and I do like it, in a Western liberal democracy is facial. And so I think it is a huge impediment. I agree with Sarah, it's a huge impediment to assimilation. So look, so that was my view on that. In terms of, what does professionalization mean? Professionalization does not mean, some sort of sterilization of discourse. Of course, in any political party, especially one that is now polling at where a third of the entire country of the electorate support you, of course you're going to have some disparity in views. You're going to have people who have different views on different things. The good news is reformers are united, absolutely united, that we need sovereignty, we need secure borders, we need to stand up and defend and protect British culture, we need law and order, and we've got to stop allowing people to come to our country and take advantage of the incredible goodwill of the British people. And so, that's what we're going to continue to focus on doing. I think, one of the other really important things we've got to do too is continue to attract incredible people to the party. Look, we do obviously have, this is a party still with 4 MPs. I mean, it's actually crazy when you think about it. We're polling it, we've gone from 14 to 34, 35% in the polls with 4 MPs when the Tories have, 121 odd, obviously Labour, a multiple of that. So we need probably the biggest challenge we are going to have over the coming years. Well, we've got many, but one of the biggest challenges is how do we attract the brightest and the best in this country who share our values, who want to stick their heads above the parapet to do incredibly important work and serve the country. And so when we think of professionalization, that's what we mean.
Who are your ideal candidates for a future reform cabinet who are not currently in reform?
Well, there's some names I could think of, but I'm not going to name them right now because it might prejudice conversations that we're having.
Might be here.
Yeah, some of them absolutely might be. I think, the first thing to say, and I gave an interview with The Telegraph yesterday about this, Nigel's already talked about it before that, but, I think the cabinet that sits around Nigel in the first reform cabinet, assuming, the British people see fit to deliver that result at the ballot box, I think probably about half will be MPs. Half of them will be appointed the Lords. I want to be clear. Nigel will put those names in front of the British people ahead of the election. Why would we do that? Well, we believe, number one, the way the current system has worked, what do you get? You get the idiocracy, right? You get the least qualified people imaginable making the most important decisions in the land. The most preponderant qualification to be a cabinet minister in many ways over the last few decades, I appreciate there's some exceptions, present company certainly notwithstanding, is, people who are, basically what they've done is they did a degree in politics and then they carried an MP's bag around for a number of years and then played the right gauntlet. And it's like, that is not the right answer if you want somebody sitting in a seat, the highest offices of the land that impact the most number of human beings in the country. So what we're saying is, look, let's open the talent pool as much as we possibly can. Some of the people we're already speaking to, who I would categorize as like galactic level talent, they don't really want to be an MP. And I would also argue there's a reasonable argument to be made that, for example, the Minister of Defense of the United Kingdom, maybe it's not the best idea that they're also spending time doing constituency surgeries discussing the chlorine level in the local swimming pool. Now, that's an important local issue, but maybe it doesn't make sense for that to be the case. And one of the other things I want to say, too, is, we get asked a lot, how are you going to take on the blob? How are you going to deal with a civil service that is potentially hostile, highly likely to be hostile to our agenda? Well, one of the reasons why the civil service has so much power is they're the adults in the room, they're the grown-ups in the room, because you have this endless carousel of ministers. If you allowed the ministers to make all the operational decisions, then what would happen? You have a new, this country had 3 chancellors in a week at one point, right? So it strengthens their argument if there is this endless carousel. You're doing education for 2 minutes, defense for 7 minutes, you're doing health 9 minutes later, and you basically know nothing about any of those things. Not even like you're not the best. You basically know nothing about those things. So the responsibility for those departments is abdicated entirely to these civil servants. And so therefore, if we are serious, if reform is deadly serious about sorting this country out, repairing the country, reversing all of the things we're talking about, good intentions and bright eyes are going to be nowhere near enough. It's important, but nowhere near enough. We have got to sort out the incentive structure. And therefore, the other thing will happen, which is that Nigel will say to these potential cabinet ministers ahead of a general election, hey, listen, I get it. You've had a great career, a glittering career. You've achieved incredible things in the real world. I get it. You're skeptical because, it's going to be a lot for you to go through for your family, and, you're going to have newspapers going to your bins. But this will be the most important work of your life. You'll get to work with other incredible people. You will play a part in shaping history for this country, and you will do the most transformative work you've ever done. In doing so, we'll be able to tell those people, hey, listen, short of you doing something absolutely egregious, you're going to have a term, right? I don't think you can judge a health secretary in 2.5 months or whatever it might be, short of, again, the clown cart of a government that we have now, where, like, you can absolutely judge to a person the entire Labour cabinet in about 2 minutes. So if you cannot, the definition of insanity is keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result. We are going to do different things.
Operation Restoring Justice, your detain and deport policy, obviously the biggest policy announcement in the last month or so that Reform have made. It depends on some pretty radical changes. So it depends on Britain leaving a whole host of international conventions, not just leaving the European Court of Human Rights and denouncing the European Convention, but probably also getting rid of the Torture Convention, getting rid of the Refugee Convention, probably making sure that the Supreme Court is changed. Now, it also depends on negotiating with other countries to say you're going to take these people, not necessarily the countries from which they came, out of this country, they're going to be deported. That will take time, won't it? So even if you do have a majority, you'll have a battle in Parliament, a battle in the courts. It'll take a year at least before the ECHR no longer applies in this country. Don't you owe it to the electorate to say, A, this will be one hell of a bust-up, and B, it will take time?
Well, in terms of having a bust-up with the establishment, bring it on, is what I say. I was asked by, actually in that same interview with the broadsheet earlier today, you're basically saying you're going to go to war with the entire political, the institutional establishment of the UK. I said, well, maybe, but it won't be it'll be a war not of our choice, but one that we're forced into, because look, we have to assume, based on all of the data we have currently, that the kind of mandate that we are putting, the kind of policies we are putting to the British people are totally antithetical to what the civil service, not all of them, I want to be clear, there are some great people who work in the civil service, but writ large, the civil service will be absolutely hostile to us, probably the Bank of England, probably the FCA, lots of members of the judiciary. And so we've got to be ready for that, and we are preparing for that now. In terms of being honest with the electorate, of course we're going to be honest, but what the electorate are going to see from us is, number one, and that's why, those conventions you just talked about, yeah, at minimum, that is a non-exhaustive list. And by the way, that would have been unconscionable to discuss inside the Conservative Party, because there would have been too many members of the parliamentary party who had not been willing to even leave. I mean, they haven't even formally announced, apparently at their conference they're going to announce that they're going to leave the ECHR. Like that's their big announcement. Look, that is a necessary but totally insufficient precondition to doing the things that we're talking about. We have worked backwards, and the draftsmen who are working on this legislation, as I said in my speech, they're very clear and strict instructions. There must not be a judge nor lawyer in the country, no matter how activist, capable of preventing a single deportation flight from leaving. Our legislation must be resilient to such activism. Obviously, there is once you issue formal notice, There's a period of, I think it's 6 months for the ECHR. But it's going to take us a little bit of time to ramp up the detention capacity. But look, one thing we knew when we announced Operation Restoring Justice was you're going to get the No We Can't Brigade coming after us, right? And of course, that's the antithesis of what Obama got elected on, for example. And, one of the really interesting things, too, is how so many of the arguments they make are like totally bogus. So, one of the things we said was, because we built a serious operational plan, which, by the way, is much, much longer than the thing we actually published for pretty obvious reasons. But, one of the things we said was we'll have an RAF Voyager as a hot spare ready to go in case there's any mechanical issues. Because if you are planning on such a large-scale deportation operation, the people... former military people who helped us with this said, you must ensure those planes keep going, because otherwise you get bottlenecks. That's why these judges that stop these deportations are so problematic to keeping these planes going. And a Labour MP popped up, sorry, a Tory MP popped up saying, oh, you see, they're not serious. How could they have a Voyager as a hot spare on standby when the RAF leases its Voyagers? It's like, if you lease a car, mate, you don't need to call the leasing company to ask whether you can take it for a drive. There are 14 Voyagers leased by the government, by the RAF. 9 of them are on constant deployment with the RAF. And by the way, the Prime Minister has an RAF Voyager on standby as we speak that he has boasted about not using. So, most of these arguments that claim that we can't do these things are bogus. But I'll also say this, when we talk about dealing with foreign countries, so Nigel came out and said, yeah. So I was like, oh, you would talk to the Taliban? I said, yeah, we talked to the Taliban about sending their illegals back there. And by the way, Germany does exactly that. Germany has already deported illegal migrants, in fact, convicted criminals back to Afghanistan via Qatar. And it's funny, because again, we announced it at the hangar in Oxfordshire. And then a load of Labour talking heads popped up, talking about how awful we are. We were awful human beings for saying that we would talk to the Taliban about returning illegal migrants back to Afghanistan to protect British people. And then what happened? Keir Starmer turned up and said, yeah, I would talk to the Taliban too about returning them. And by the way, the last one I'll make on that is this country is already going to give £151 million in aid to Afghanistan. And maybe it's a reasonable argument, don't you think, that the British taxpayer, for that generosity, might expect the least Afghanistan could do would be take back their illegal migrants.
It may or may not surprise you to know that when I was in the last government and I was on the periphery of a discussion about the Rwanda program, one of the ministers pointed out that it would be a charter flights that would be taking people to Rwanda. And when I asked why we weren't using military aircraft, I was told that the military thought it would be bad for their image if that happened. But anyway, we will see what might happen in the future.
But actually, I want to pick up on that point. So it doesn't surprise me, but I would argue that the whole point of that... So if there are people in the military saying it would be bad for their image to actually promote the sovereignty of this country, then those people need to be fired and replaced. It's as simple as that.
Firing people will be a necessary part of getting government under control. We know that we face a big economic challenge, and we know that reform, unless you're going to tell me different, are opposed to tax increases. That means spending will have to be cut. The biggest areas of spending in government are welfare and the NHS. Will they face cuts?
Well, the first thing we got to do is address waste. All right. So too often these conversations are super reductive and kind of dishonest. There is no doubt. Look, my parents have given a huge portion of their lives to service to the NHS. In fact, my dad has only ever done NHS work as a matter of principle. He's foregone higher earnings that he could have had in the private sector. So the NHS is very close to my heart. But there's no doubt, even from talking to them at the dinner table, there's an enormous amount of waste inside the NHS. And we could spend hours and hours talking about that. So the first point is, we've got to eliminate the waste. The second thing is we've got to, make sure that the demand on these services is no longer just growing exponentially because we have open borders. And the NHS is no longer just a national health service for the United Kingdom. It's a health service for the entire world. We've got to stop that. And that is something reform is going to do. We're clear-eyed and we're serious about the fact that obviously we have an aging population, that the cost of taking care of our elderly is going to increase. But yeah, we should take care of our elderly, Michael, and I think we want to have an NHS that we can be proud of. But you can only do those things, number one, if you have the money to do it. You know, so often the conversation is about, oh, you know, we're going to take from this pie and put into another, input into that part of the pie. We need an economy that is growing rapidly again. That is what we need. You know, in order to take care of our elderly, in order to fill the hearts of our young people with hope, we need an economy that is in a top. We could easily be, I think, a top 5 GDP per capita country in the world if we just had politicians who are not actively harming the country, like directly with their policies, with things like net zero, with things like the insane, you know, human quantitative easing that they've been doing for years.
We'll turn on to pro-growth policies in a second, but you talked understandably about the NHS in order to reassure people here. Welfare, of course, is another big area. If I'm right, and please again correct me if I'm wrong, Reform are committed to lifting the two-child benefit cap. You want more British families to have more children, so lift that cap. Reform are committed to the triple lock for pensions. Reform are also not going to scrap the restored winter fuel payments. So is there any area of the welfare budget that you've got your eye on at the moment to cut?
Well, Nigel's was asked about the triple lock, and he said, you know, he will make a, you know, that is something he will talk about in time as we head towards a general election. In terms of the two-child cap, look, I make no apologies for this. And number one, Nigel's made clear, this will only be available to British people who work. That's the first point. But look, we have a collapsed birth rate. We have a collapsed birth rate. And we are actually serious. We are actually deadly serious about halting migration and securing our borders. And you know, so when would it be appropriate for the state to intervene? Probably when there's market failure. With the current birth rate, if you just look at, if you assume net immigration goes to zero, and you extrapolate that, and you look at the current fertility rate, there's basically no human beings left in this country in a few hundred years. Now, if that is not market failure, you'd have to explain to me what market failure is. So again, this isn't about, you know, taxpayers funding foreign families with 9 kids. That's not what this is about. But we make no apologies because we are serious about halting immigration. We want to do everything. You know, this is also a part of a much bigger policy set that we will have. We must make financials and finance no obstacle to British people having children. We need them to have kids. And our view is, and Nigel's view is, if you have people who want to have kids and who are able to have kids, then the government should support them in doing that.
Few people in politics have a background as steeped in tech as you do. What difference will AI make to government and to our lives, and will it lead to a future reform government having to deal with mass unemployment?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a real risk that we're going to see a significant issue in terms of white-collar jobs. We may not, but it definitely seems that there's a non-negligible chance that that happens. I think we're moving into an era now of the next 20, 25 years. We'll see more societal change in the West as a result of technology than we saw over the last 200 years. That is just what is happening. So, you know, we're going to have to think carefully about what the right policies there are. I think it's really important that Britain can be one of the leaders in the world with regards to AI. We need our own data centers and our own compute capability. We have none of that, really, because we have an appalling energy policy that makes it impossible, really, for those things to make sense. I think, you know, probably the other really important thing that is going to happen is I do think technology will have an important role. It's not the only thing, but will have an important role to play in making our NHS more efficient, in making sure that more people in this country have access to better healthcare. 3 of the top 10 STEM universities on the planet are on these little islands of ours. We should be extremely proud of that. And so, you know, it's funny because when you talk to people in Asia, you talk to people in America, they're amazed about how, you know, this country makes so little of its amazing strengths. And like I said, yes, there are concerns and there are threats with regards to AI, but Britain should be leading the world in AI. I mean, DeepMind, there's a guy, how many of you have heard of Sedemis Hassibis, for example? Yeah, so, Sedemis was the founder of a company called DeepMind that was sold to Google some years ago, won a Nobel Prize for Science for software code, where they were able to accurately model protein folding through software. And it's difficult to overstate how important that is, because what's happening now is it's allowing for a massively accelerated process for drug discovery. There's going to be transformative drugs that will come out that will allow all of us and our relatives to live lives free of disease for much, much longer as a direct result of that work. These are British scientists, British engineers, doing this work. This country does an awful job of commercializing that, of ensuring that value is distilled and diffused through the entire population. Everybody in the country should know who someone like Sedemis is. And instead, we've had successive governments who chase people like him. I know he's still here. That's because he just loves the country. Most such people have been chased out of the country. And by the way, DeepMind was sold to Google probably way too early, than it should have been, because there was a lack of capital available to such companies. So I think we need to focus on the opportunity set of such things. I think Britain can lead the world in the new technologies.
4 quick-fire questions from me, and then I'll hand over to the audience. I'll give you notice of them in order. I'm going to ask you, Zia, what the single worst and the single best thing that this government has done. Brief answers. The single worst and the single best thing that the Tories did when they were in power. The single worst and the single best thing about Trump. And then I'm going to ask you, which is worse, or who is worse? Tommy Robinson or Jeremy Corbyn? No, okay, those are the 4. So the first one, this government, best and worst.
Okay, so worst, I honestly do not probably forming a government in the first place would be the, coming to power with no plan. Yeah, forming a government in the first place. Honestly, we'd be all day. Is there anything good that they've done? I genuinely cannot think of one. I genuinely, you're on layers of gradation. No, I'm afraid. Nope. I cannot think of a single good thing.
Nope.
With the Tories, what was the worst thing they did? Claim in 4 successive manifestos they were going to bring net migration down to tens of thousands, and then leave office with that number at 1 million. I think that was pretty catastrophic, but there are many other things I could talk about there. What was the best thing they did? I actually would say that some of the things they did around education were actually very, very important and helpful. I think there's a lot more actually to do, and I'm sure you'd agree with that, but there was a period there where they did hold the line on that assault. So I would give them some credit for that. But again, I'm afraid the scorecard is heavily skewed, like insanely heavily skewed to the negative, Michael. Okay. So
and the Donald, best thing he's done and the worst thing he's done?
The best thing I think he's done is revivify that sense of optimism in America. This idea that America, it was morning again in America, and America can walk tall again and stop apologizing for itself and its past, and be excited about its future. Probably the worst thing, I'm not a huge fan of the tariffs that he's imposed on this country. I'm not a huge fan of those. I'm not a huge fan of tariffs generally. But listen, President Trump he's America first. He's going to do deals to benefit America. And in terms of Jeremy listen, absolutely the worst is Jeremy Corbyn. This is a man who basically refused to say, when he was running to be the Prime Minister, refused to even say he would use our nuclear deterrent in the event we were attacked first with a nuclear weapon, thus rendering our entire Trident program null void. I can't get into the head of someone who would do that. And I would say this too, Tommy Robinson has said things about the rape gangs and was making those arguments for years, and was disparaged, and has been proven to be correct on those matters and deserves some credit for that. So,
could he ever join Reform?
No.
Very clear. Okay, over to the audience. And the gentleman there has been trying very hard, so I'll give him the first word. There's the microphone. Remember, short question, and do introduce yourself by name.
So my name is Rick Angiers. Mr. Gove, as a very competent minister, when are you joining Reform? And for Yusuf, as a tech entrepreneur, can you explain to us why so little seems to be invested in the IT department of head office, and why it's taken more than 10 weeks for a newly formed branch to get the nation builder details, which we still don't have, so we can contact people within our area, and I can tell you later which one it is. And so what will you do to enable people that are trying to contact head office to actually respond? All of my colleagues have sent lots of messages to all of you, and we get nothing back. So you're very good at asking for contributions, but very slow in responding to the People's Army.
Okay. I think Reform has attracted so much talent. There is no room for a minnow like me. Is what I would say. But the one thing is that it's a technical point. Is the point that was raised by our colleague there, is that one that those of you who are Reform members here would tend to agree with? Is it's a growing pain question for the party? Zia?
Yeah, look, I totally hear that. Look, so firstly, I'm not the chairman of the party anymore, and we've got a team that is growing to address that particular issue. But look, even when I was chairman, I totally accept it was an issue. You know, as you scale something to be this big in such a short period of time, and you also want your systems to be resilient and secure, unfortunately, there are some growing pains on that. But I will speak, I will go, as soon as this is done, I will go speak to the team. Let's exchange details and make sure that that's sorted.
Thank you. And yes, just there, in the third row. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jessica Hill. I'm commissioning editor of an online newspaper called FE Week. We do further education and skills. Skills have been lacking so far in Reform's policy agenda. And if you're going to cut immigration, we already have massive skills shortages in this country, which it's a struggle to get plugged. So how are you going to fill those skills shortages without also increasing funding into that?
Yes, and I also meant the lady next to you as well. Sorry, so in fairness, both. So one on FE and...
Hiya, my name is Matilda Martin. I'm a journalist with Politics Home. I have a kind of linked question to you. You said that you respected a lot of what the Tories did in education. What do you think are the key issues with education policy at the moment? What would Reform do for education? What would be the key changes you would make in both schools and universities and FE?
So linked questions on education.
Yeah, so look, on education, I think number one, for example, undo some of the vandalism that this Labour government has done, reverse the VAT, stop seeing education as a chargeable good, and take away the awful VAT that they've just placed on private school fees. I think we've also got to stop schools from becoming indoctrination camps. And I know there's legislation that is very clear that, you know, teachers must be balanced and must not indoctrinate children. But my inbox is full. My inbox is absolutely full. You know what? Not just from worried parents, but from kids. But from kids in school who say that they're being taught that Nigel Farage is this or that. Or when they articulate their view that they like Nigel, that they're asked to stay behind in class. I'm not kidding. And they're admonished by the teachers. And so I think we've got to look very seriously at that. I think we're moving into an era now, by the way, as a result of things like AI, we've got to ask very seriously, what is the purpose of our education system? We've got to, and we haven't really talked about universities. I think we've got a massive issue there. Those are even more so our indoctrination camps, sadly. We have way too many young people taking on degrees, getting themselves tens of thousands of pounds into debt for, not all of them, but some of them, frankly, are degrees that do not make them more employable, don't allow them to earn more. So these are all things that we've got to look at. And, you know, one of the, you know, that question about skills, which I guess is connected, I love that question, because what it points to is exactly the challenge if you want to have a coherent policy set. And really a unique opportunity that Reform has, because we have a little bit of time to put this stuff together, because you're absolutely right. And this is why we talked about the two-child cap. Because we're, you know, you can tell we're serious about cutting net migration to zero at least, because we're talking about such policies. Evidence that a party is not serious about that is saying, yeah, we'd cut net migration to zero, and we're not going to do everything we can to get British people to have kids. We're just going to allow, for example, the working age population in this country to halve over the next 40 years. I mean, it's totally unserious. And so when we talk about skills, yeah, so if we say, no, we got to have British jobs, we got to have, British people should have asymmetric access to the job market. We are going to have issues if we do what we want to do with immigration around care home visas and engineers. I was talking earlier about, we want to proliferate small modular nuclear reactors across the country at unprecedented speed. We probably need more engineers. But to the degree that visas will be issued on a gross basis for such skills, and only for such skills, it will only ever be sanctioned if we are simultaneously launching the most audacious and unprecedented scale-up process to upskill and train British people in those jobs. And that is the kind of joined-up thinking we simply haven't had in this country. So that's what it'll be. It'll be a focus on where are we going to have skill shortages. To the degree that a visa must be issued for a highly skilled, nuclear engineer to come to this country, we have to make sure that we are simultaneously ramping up skills training. And yeah, that will take funding.
Thank you. And we'll just go to, first of all, the young lady in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th row, then the gentleman in the 3rd row, and then the young lady in the first row here. 3 questions in quick succession, and then we'll move over to the other side.
Zia, I think Nigel's going to be our next Prime Minister, and a jolly good one he'll be. But given his advancing years and the fact that he's taken a battering for so many decades now, there's probably only so much one body, one mind can take, and maybe he won't want to do more than a term. Do you see yourself as a possible successor and future Prime Minister of this amazing country?
You have 2 more questions coming in which you can think about your replies here. Yes, gentleman there and then lady there.
Hi, my name's Imran Mullah. I'm the British political correspondent at Middle East Eye. I want to talk about foreign policy. Israel last week killed 2 of my colleagues, among other journalists in Gaza. The British government issued a statement of concern. I just heard people applauding there. I think that's disgusting. My question is, do you think Israel has killed too many innocent people in Gaza, and would a reform government seek to stop the war?
And young lady in the front row.
Charlotte Forsyth, I'm a NHS consultant, so no surprises, this is going to be about the NHS. I was just interested to know whether or not the party has the appetite and bravery to make some big changes to the NHS. Because as an employee, I know that the current issues are not just down to waste and immigration, or is the party paralysed by the, as I've unfounded statements from Nigel Farage around wanting to privatise the NHS?
Okay, so in terms of Nigel, look, number one, I would say this. I don't think I've spent more time with a human... Nigel is the human being I've spent more time with over the last 14 and a half months than any other. And, one of the things I'm quite proud of is I'm quite high energy, to use a Trump term. I'm kind of a workaholic. I wake up in the morning, the first thing I do is check my phone and get to work. Working with Nigel makes me feel low energy. He makes me feel low energy. He is relentless. After, during the election campaign, we do 3 days, 3 nights, and I'm thinking, right, I actually just need to recuperate. He's headed off, not just to another event, but he's getting on a plane somewhere. So, he is relentless, and I'll tell you this, he has got many, many, many years in him yet. I will say this too, that, the Constitution, which we helped draft, which is now live, has been approved and ratified by members, means that one day, when there is another leader of reform, that decision will be made by all of you. It will be made, by all of you. And I sincerely hope, and I'm working really, really hard to ensure that we will have incredibly talented people. We already have incredibly talented people. I would argue that every single one of our MPs, would be in the running for such a position. But you know what's really cool? Do you know what's really cool is that we don't spend any time thinking about such questions. And this was another really important point. We are united behind Nigel. We know what our objective is. We know what our mission is. One day, look, nobody goes on forever, of course. It'll be up to all of you to make that decision. But right now, we have one goal and one goal only, and that is to get Nigel into number 10 Downing Street.
And you would want to say anything about Israel Gaza or the NHS to the lady who's a consultant?
Yeah, such a great question. Because again, my family, my brother's a radiologist as well. So, I speak to a lot of people in the NHS, and I think there's a couple of points that need to be made really clearly. Number one, the NHS must remain free for people to use. I think that is actually critically important. My assessment, you will know better than I, and we're going to have people working on this stuff. Maybe you could help us. Hopefully you will help us. Identify, yes, waste, because there is waste. I accept, though, that isn't the panacea. There's more work to do. But we also have to make sure that, that there is a opportunity for access to our health system which isn't totally dependent, for example, on how much money you make. I do think private healthcare has an important role to play in this country. It's funny because my dad never did private work as a matter of principle. When I started a company, as soon as we could afford it as a company, I gave everyone in my company private Bupa health insurance because I almost took the opposite view that I felt bad that they might be taking up an NHS bed when they might not have to. So these are complicated issues. I would say so long as we're within those guardrails of keeping it free at the point of use and that the amount of money you have in your bank account or will not be preventative of you getting access to world-class healthcare. So long as that is true, then yes, we have to look at everything. Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the Middle East, look, you asked us whether a Prime Minister Farage would do everything he could to stop that awful war. You better be darn sure he would. Absolutely. Nigel believes in peace through strength. We think the Ministry of Defense, we think our armed forces should be proud and powerful and well-funded and equipped for the new age and make any enemy think twice before testing us. Sadly, despite, and this is no indictment at all, of the brilliant people who serve in our military. And by the way, we speak to these people. We speak to these people all the time. I want to make this point too, because we talked about, somebody saying the military might say this or that. That is not, and I accept there are people like that, and I hear these stories. That is not the preponderant view in the military. I speak to so many active members of His Majesty's Royal Navy, including quite senior people who tell me no one is more abhorred than they are about the state of affairs with the small boat. They've never had the political clarity. They've never had the will to be able, from leadership politically, to be able to do that. So Nigel wants an end to that war. But look, you've got to be realistic about what that also means. You need Hamas to give up the hostages. I do think it's very difficult. I think it's very difficult. I do think it's very difficult to arrange a sustainable long-term peace with an organization whose founding documents literally say that Israel has no right to exist, is illegitimate, and must be eradicated, right? So there's a reason why we have a war in the Middle East. It's an incredibly intractable problem. President Trump is working really hard to end it to the degree that a Prime Minister of the United Kingdom can. And by the way, Britain's influence on the world stage, sadly, has greatly waned over the last few years, in no small part due to performative non-entity actions. The Prime Minister Farage will do everything he can to end the war in the Middle East, yeah.
That's great. Final questions. The young lady there just in the front on the second row with the greyish cardigan, and then the gentleman further along in the second row just there with his raised hand. So first of all...
Hi, my name is Natasha Norris. I'm a reporter at Planning Magazine. You've said that you want to put the interests of everyone in the country at the centre of your policies. So just wondered, for a topic as contentious as planning for housing and where it should go and other development, how will you do that in the interests of everyone in the country?
Great. And then final question, just gentleman over there in the second row. Yeah.
Hello, testing. This is Ed Mack for Courage Media Searcher. Hi, Zia. I was very impressed by your speech earlier. I'm interested in your thoughts on flying the English flag. You mentioned that everyone else should be allowed to fly their flags, the flag of India, the flag of Pakistan. My question is, do you see the English flying their flag as one identity amongst a sea of many, or is England their country?
So there's two non-controversial topics. Where should new homes go and flags?
Yeah, so let's address the flag thing. I want to be clear about, I think you maybe misinterpreted what I said. What I was saying is that it isn't controversial. I defy you to find a person in Pakistan who is, arrested, at least in part seemingly, for raising the Pakistani flag, right? My point is that it is not controversial for Japanese people to say that they're proud of Japan and to raise the Japanese flag. So what I'm saying is we should be proud of our flags. Look, one of the things that reform councils did when we took control of 10 councils was pass motions that said the only flags that would be permitted to fly on council premises in those counties, in the county council premises, would be the St. George's flag, because they're English councils, the county's flag, the royal flags, and flags of our armed forces. No political activist flags, no flags of foreign countries of any sort. And by the way, that might seem like a really common sense thing. The amount of hostility that we got and still get, by the way, from the blob and some civil servants, notably, about such a policy, refuse to do it, is really interesting. It's also really interesting that while people are raising the Union flag, raising the St. George's flag, suddenly people pop up and say, why are you so obsessed with flags? Why are we so obsessed with flags? This is coming from people where you can walk around London and see the flag of every other country other than our own. Where flags were shoved down our throats all of the time. So, look, we've got to be proud of our country, and that's what I was referring to there. It was about saying, I actually do believe, yes, it is important that there's not only an identity around the United Kingdom. I think it's important there's a national identity in England and in Wales, in Scotland as well. In terms of planning, look, one of the really interesting things when you talk to house builders and stuff is that this idea that local residents are just constantly blocking everything. There's some of that. The much bigger issue are around the crazy eco rules that are in place, where, famously, bat tunnels are an impediment, hundreds of millions of pounds being spent on such things. If you look at the environmental impact reports on any major infrastructure project or house building project, they're insanely long. I defy you, go and try reading these things. They're interminable. So they're massively over, there's way too much bureaucracy. So we have to reform planning laws in this country to get homes being built at great speed. But I'd say this too, it's a bit like any other aspect where, there's a national good, right, which might have some local negative externality, right? And that will happen in any serious country. And if you're having serious conversations about policy, you need that. Well, you cannot look British people in the eyes and say, you know what, yeah, we want to build this new housing project and it's going to be kind of noisy and it's going to be near you, while also saying that Britain must basically take infinity migrants from countries where people are basically coming here to take advantage of our goodwill, and we'll have open borders and you'll pay for that too. And by the way, they will get priority on that housing when it gets built. You can't look British people in the eyes and make that case. And I defy you to say, I think young people have had a very raw deal. Reform has a unique opportunity because we are the only party with a serious shot of government which has pretty even support across the generations. We're polling, a poll came out the other day where we have 23% of 16 and 17-year-olds support reform. And similarly, we have very high levels of support amongst elderly pensioners as well, and everyone in between. Even areas that even people like millennials who voted resoundingly to Remain, a lot of them now are switching to Reform because they can see the raw deal that millennials have gotten from the political establishment. The Tories have virtually no support under 30, almost none at all, very little under 40, and Labour virtually no support above 40. So we have a unique opportunity to restore another social contract that we must all be very worried about, that must be repaired, which is the social contract between the young and the older generations. Reform has an opportunity to do that. We have to build more houses, and we will build at speed when Nigel's the Prime Minister. But We must stop the population explosion and stop telling British people that they're at the back of the queue when it comes to housing.
Ladies and gentlemen, Zia's been incredibly generous with his time. We've overrun our allotted hour. Can we please thank Zia very, very much indeed?
Thank you very much, everyone. I can't thank you enough for coming. Thank you.
And I'll just allow Zia to get off to his next engagement. It's a busy 48 hours for him. Just to say that I think The Spectator, apart from GB News, is the only media organisation to have a meeting here at the Reform Conference. Our politics team of Tim Shipman, James Heal and Lucy Dunn will give you every day and every week the best coverage of UK politics and the deepest analysis of what's going on with reform as we consider what's going to happen at the next general election. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.